Hey, good morning, everyone. We are excited to be with you. Whether you are a longtime member of the church or whether you are just tuning in for the first time, we want to say welcome. Man, we would love to have everybody in person. I miss people.
I do.
But we are where we are, and so we are grateful for this technology. We're grateful to be together. And really hoping you guys enjoy this morning. I'm really excited about the conversation. I think it's it's a necessary conversation. So we are in part 2 of our quarantine conversations. If you are just joining us for the first time, I'd really encourage you to go back and watch week 1. So in week 1, we addressed more specifically our church's response to COVID. I know with what's happening in the Elmer area, there's a lot of people questioning, what is the church doing? How are people responding? We talked about civil disobedience, what that kind of stuff looks like. So I'd really, really encourage you. It was my conversation with Michael Cron. If you have not watched it, make sure you go back and watch it. So today we talk about Mennonite myths, fact or fiction. I worked at CAMI for a bunch of years, and it was really funny because anytime I mentioned the fact that I was a Mennonite, the first comment always had something to do with a horse and buggy. And so it was hilarious. And as soon as you play with it, because most people are joking, but then every now and again you come across the right person who you can actually pull it off, and you're like, yeah, no, I got your horse and buggy, I park in the back and whatever. It's hilarious. But people just don't know. And you know what? If we're honest with ourselves, there's so many other cultures that we don't know a whole lot about either. And so while today we're having the conversation about Mennonites, because that's what we are, really this is a part of a bigger conversation that needs to happen. There are a lot of people in the Elmer area who are not Mennonite who also feel misunderstood. There are people who come from different ethnicities, different backgrounds, different countries. Even within the Mennonite community, there's people who do not understand what other Mennonites are. And so this is a conversation that's bigger than just me saying, hey, you guys need to know about my background. No, it's bigger. We need to know about each other. We need to know what others' background is. We talked about community last week, and if we're going to build a better Elmer, a better Elgin, one of the ways we're going to have to do that is to learn how to get along with people who don't see the world the way we do. We're going to have to get along with people who have a whole different background, a different worldview. And one of the ways of being able to do that better, and I would argue, is you got to get to know each other's perspective at least. And when you understand each other, you can at least understand where they're coming from, and that provides an opportunity for dialogue. And that's what we want to have today. So let me tell you a little bit about myself. I'm Mennonite. I'm Deitch. I like Zoot. So if you guys don't understand what that is, then I'm sorry, but that's what we are. We like sunflower seeds in German. I was born in Mexico. I've been here since I was 3, so I have some baby pictures. A lot of you guys will know my red-bearded brother who works for the town of Elmer. But if you've ever wondered, actually, Dimitri, we're going to start on picture 2. Sorry, I'm going completely backwards here. Picture 2, if you've ever wondered what my brother looks like without a beard, you can see him on the far side. But that is my brother and me and some cousins. If you go back to picture 1, making our poor tech guys go all over the place here. If you go back to picture 1, Dimitri, that is me and my sister. And so Sue, if you were watching, that is us as babies. But yeah, we were born in Mexico, moved here when I was 3. And so I have been here my entire life. And one of the things, and I'm sure other people with different ethnicities feel the same way, but you sometimes forget that people still see you as different. And that was one of the things that last year kind of caught me off guard, because I've been here my whole life. I'm very involved in the community. I don't see myself as different than anyone from Elmer. And then all of a sudden you start hearing comments and you're like, oh wait, they still see me as different. And so we thought it was a good conversation. In my history, I know a lot of Mennonites will say that they struggled in school. They were picked on and bullied. That hasn't been my experience. I loved where I grew up. Did a lot of street hockey on the roads. Like we had a great time growing up. I've noticed it more now as an adult, that there's bitterness and hatred towards some of the Mennonites, and so that's part of why I want to address it. But hey, we're not here just to listen to me. One of the things I do know, because I don't know that much, but I know if I surround myself with people who are smarter than me, that keeps me out of trouble. And so when we were thinking about having this conversation, I wanted to bring on my friend Anne, who I have known for a lot of years. She is an elder here at the church, but she's also been a longtime advocate for the Mennonite families in our community. She has served here, been here most of her life. Before I get you to tell your story, I want to give a quick disclaimer. We are going to be about an hour, which means that we cannot even come close to covering everything about what this actually means. So if you have questions, I would encourage you guys to post them, whether you're on YouTube or on Facebook. If you don't want to go publicly and you just want to send them to us privately, just shoot us a message. And if we can't get to all the questions today, that's fine. We can go later on throughout the week and converse with people. But we'll do our best to cover the key main points. So with that, Anne, why don't you talk a little bit about your history, kind of how you got to where you are, the work you do now, and then we'll lead into some more questions.
Sure. So, like Albert, that's the one thing we do have in common. I was born in Mexico in a colony in Zacatecas. But we moved around quite a bit, I think, in Mexico, as far as I can understand, anyway, and moved to Canada, to Ontario specifically, when I was 3 years old. So we initially settled in the Leamington area, and as other Low German-speaking Mennonites do, we settled in areas where there were family and other Mennonite families. And then we moved to the KW area when I was about 5, and lived there until I was 10. When I was 10, we moved to the Elmer area, and what that really, I think, was eye-opening. And I think because I had the experience I did in Kitchener, living in Elmer was a completely different experience for me, and it was so drastically different, it was kind of seared into my memory. In Kitchener, Waterloo, there are many ethnicities. I was one of many kids who could speak a different language in school, and to be a Mennonite wasn't a big deal there at all. I remember very specifically, a huge memory for me was the first day of school when I moved to Elmer, grade 5. A student said to me, "Oh, you're one of those." And for the first time I realized being Low German-speaking Mennonite in Elgin County wasn't a good thing. Where in the KW area, Mennonites were very respected, and different ethnicities were encouraged. So it was a pretty drastic difference for me, and I realized very quickly that we were as a people the other group, and that was both from peers and teachers alike. I could, and I know that my experience wasn't anything different than other people my age, other Mennonite kids my age. I had a teacher tell me when I was 16 that I wasn't worth educating because I was just going to quit school and get married and have a baby. So why bother? That I proved her wrong. I went to college, went to university twice. I have my master's in social work. And I work at Family and Children's Services in St. Thomas. I started working there almost 24 years ago, long time. Never thought I was going to be a lifer there, but I really do believe that God made me for that work. I feel like I make a difference in the lives of our families and kids in our community. Where it specifically kind of connected with my Mennonite faith. So I just want to just briefly touch on, so as a child, learning very quickly that being a Mennonite kid wasn't a good thing, being called names, having teachers, say you're not worth being educated, that kind of stuff, that wasn't a good thing. So I really tried to distance myself from my faith and my culture. And really didn't want much to do. I very rarely spoke Low German in public at all. Like to anybody. I would not make any effort to let anybody know that I was Low German-speaking Mennonite. And then I got this job at the agency, and we had some things that happened in our community that required the specific skill set of a Low German-speaking worker. So for 10 years, I worked specifically as the designated Low German-speaking child protection worker. I worked with Mennonite, Low German-speaking Mennonites, conservative Mennonites, as well as the Amish community. So I did that for 10 years, and I passed that torch on to one of my very, very capable colleagues. Through that experience, I really became proud to be a Mennonite. Really? We're not supposed to say that because we're supposed to be humble, but I am incredibly proud of my heritage, of the amazing things that our community does for each other. We really do have a support system within our own community just because you're Mennonite. just because you're connected to this community, you are able to tap into resources that other people don't necessarily have. And so I've come to really understand our people much better. And that position, I think, forced me to better understand who I was, who our people were, and where we came from. So I grew up not really kind of understanding why I was a Mexican by birth, but blonde hair and blue-eyed. That didn't make sense to me at all. So I have Hispanic relatives. My grandfather's second wife is Mexican. And so I know Spanish-speaking Mexicans, that's what we think of when we think of Mexicans. But why was I blonde hair and blue-eyed? So as an adult, I really kind of dived into our history and why we did the things we do. And so through that experience, I think that I've gotten a better understanding of our people and what challenges they experience, but what are the strengths they can offer into our community as well.
Right.
So that's kind of where that came from.
Well, I think one of the things that this kind of brings about when we have topics or conversations in general about race and ethnicity is that your personal experience doesn't justify categorizing an entire group.
Absolutely.
So now there's a reason in Elmer people had a certain taste towards the Mexican Mennonites. Mm-hmm. And I know this, and we were aware of that. We knew coming up here, we knew some of the people who were troublemakers. We know that. But that doesn't justify categorizing an entire group that way, and I think that's the danger.
Absolutely.
The danger of going, well, those people. Well, no, within Elmer, there are people who are awesome, and there are people who are not. Mm-hmm. But they're not all the same ethnicity. They're not all Mennonites. They're not all English. And I think anytime you do that, and I mean, history has shown us that. We've done that. When you talk about racism, we do this with people's color of skin. We make assumptions that are so dangerous. Mm-hmm. And this is why we think, as a church community, getting to know the individual matters so much. Getting to know the person. We're both Mennonites, but we are very different. And there are Mennonites who are going to be watching this who see things very differently than we do. And I think that's part of the beauty of being humanity, and it's the beauty of a community where you have diverse, or where you are diverse. We don't all need to think the same. I think there's a plurality of voices really helps create a much more beautiful understanding of what it means to be human. And so that's one of the things, if you are not Mennonite and you are part of another group, my hope is that we can open this dialogue to say, look, we should never be categorizing entire populations based on your own personal experience. And if you've had a bad experience with a Mennonite, it might have even been me, I don't know. But that doesn't mean the entire population is that way. And I think that's been one of the dangers that we really found last year. And I know, and people don't mean to, often when they say things that are hurtful, they don't necessarily mean to, but one of the local politicians says, it's those people who are causing this issue. And I'm like, no, I'm a deputy chief at a fire station. I'm on the front lines. Like, don't tell me it's those people, because I am one of those people. And they don't mean to, but I think that's where thinking through and getting to know people and checking yourself. What biases do I have? And am I speaking out of those, or am I actually speaking out of truth? And so,
absolutely.
Thanks for sharing that. So let's talk first. I want to start with this. Growing up, even as a Mennonite, I had no idea how diverse we were, because I kind of assumed every Mennonite was like me. And so one of the things that's been really neat for me to learn about is even how broad the Mennonite community is. So why don't you walk us through that a little bit?
Sure. I know, Dimitri, just before we get started there, Dimitri, you've got some pictures there of our little Mennonite experience. My family, maybe pull up that first one, just so you can see. That's what we looked like just before we migrated here. I'm the chubby girl in the back. Not much has changed. And then the second one, one of my colleagues thinks that it's that face and that fat little girl right there hasn't changed much either, right? A little grouchy face going on. But anyway, we'll talk about what it, like, just pull up that first world map if you don't mind. So what you see in this world map, this is taken from, I think, the Mennonite World Conference. And we count, which is really good. We count our numbers, we count our people and who belongs to our groupings. But these are all of the different groupings of Mennonite worldwide. So if you take a look at that, just look at that at the map itself, you might notice a couple of things. There's a lot of groupings in North America. You see quite a big chunk in South America as well. But take a look at Africa and Asia. There's a lot in that group as well. And so what I learned over my, really diving into my culture and my faith is that Mennonite means a little bit more than what my limited viewpoint was for many years. I thought only Dicha were Mennonite. I remember the very first time somebody said to me that they were Mennonite from, what country was it? It was a North America, not a North American country, but a European country. And I was like, there's no such thing. And then I realized, oops, there is such a thing, right? So that was a big eye-opener for me as well. So just taking a look at that. If you flip to the next slide, Dimitri, you'll see that's the 2012 Mennonite and Brethren in Christ World Membership. So Brethren in Christ is also a way that we refer to ourselves as Mennonites. So you take a look at 2012, that Africa has got 600, almost 700,000. North America, 500,000. Total, we've got about 1.7 million Mennonites worldwide. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I want you to flip to the next one, which is 2018. Got it? Take a look at that bottom number there. We're 2 million, over 2 million Mennonites worldwide. So I joke at the agency with my bosses all the time that Mennonites are taking over the world. And we really are. If you look at those numbers, in 4 years, we've gone up 500,000. But what I really want you to take a look up here is we are.
That's the conspiracy theory no one's talking about.
Nobody's talking about that one.
Like I got 6 kids. Like I'm doing my part, so.
And we are taking, what I want to highlight though, it isn't just us white European Mennonites that are populating well. It's actually our white numbers are going down, but where we're noticing an increase in our numbers are Caribbean and Asian and Pacific Mennonites. And that is because one of the big things that people don't necessarily realize, I think, when we speak about what Mennonite means, is that Mennonite does not necessarily just refer to a culture or one people group. It really does refer to a faith denomination. It is Christian, but it is a denomination like any other denomination, Baptist, Lutheran, Pentecostal. We are a Protestant denomination from the Christian faith. So I use this just to highlight for folks that being a Mennonite means more than one thing. And what we're going to talk about today is kind of a couple of pieces of that, some of our cultural understanding of what it means to be a Mennonite, but also what our faith beliefs mean.
Okay, so let's jump into that a little bit then, because I think for a lot of people that is a misunderstanding. So one of the funny stories that we have coming out of Bible college is we were in Manitoba, and Josie actually went on this road trip with a whole group, but one of them was black. And when the police pulled him over, his last name was Thies, and I can't remember his first name, but the officer refused to believe that was his real name. He's like, because you're not white. Mennonites have all been white. There's no way. And so it was one of those things where there's a lot of misunderstanding. And I would have been the same way because all I knew was what I knew, right? Totally. So you go to Mexico, well, all the Mennonites there look the same. So that must mean what it's like worldwide, which isn't even close to it. But then it's not even just that. It's just because you're Mennonite, because when you look at us, we don't dress Mennonite, what people would assume is Mennonite. So there's a couple different categories. So why don't you talk to us about local Mennonites and what that looks like and the differences when people use the term Mennonite, because it's not just all cultural.
For sure. So Dimitri, if you just want to pull up that first slide and then I'll talk a little bit about it. So Mennonites, I think, in my understanding is that we can kind of divide ourselves into 3 different groups: historical, cultural, and then faith Anabaptist. So historical, you can identify a Mennonite sometimes by their last name. So that would be their historical understanding. So their family background may have roots in our Anabaptist history and our Anabaptist faith. So if you were Russian Mennonite or from our Russian heritage, you would have last names like Wall, Lowen, Thiessen, Friesen, Dyke, Froese. Those are really, really common. Clausen, I probably should say Clausen, one of the most common. It's like Smith, right? Like very, very common last names. That is how you might identify someone as being Mennonite. They can also be connected to the cultural heritage. So if you met my mom, you would see she wears a head covering. She wears homemade dresses. And you can, by her outward appearance, assume that she has an ethnic affiliation to the Mennonite, to the Low German-speaking Mennonite group. And so that cultural affiliation is really made from a shared experience, right? So we have many of the same experiences. If you were raised in the colony, you would be able to really talk about how that shared experience created a culture for them.
Okay, so pause here for a second, because it's something we're not really going to address, but when we talk about Mennonites, the word colony is used a lot. Describe for us, what are you talking about colony in a little bit, and what effect that has had on us now?
For sure. So colonies are not communes. I'm just going to make that a colony. We probably use a really bad word to mean colony. I think it probably came from Russia, where we were living in communities. It really actually just means community. So if you were to visit a colony in Mexico or Bolivia or Belize or Paraguay, any of the South American countries, you would see a community. It looks like a town, but everybody in that town is Mennonite. Everybody would speak Low German. Everybody would have the ability to speak Low German, I should say. You might have very similar expectations for gender roles, expectations for women, men and children. Their routines may look very similar. The way that they may farm or take care of their family farms may look very similar. A colony just describes the community that people live in that is exclusive to the Low German speaking Mennonite families. So so if you were looking at Mexico, Hispanic Mexicans wouldn't live on the colony. It would just primarily be Low German speaking Mennonite families that live on a colony.
Now, there's also a huge range within that. So
Absolutely.
We have Benny and Esther, who are close friends of ours, work in Bolivia. So we went and visited that. Well, what is considered colony there would have been different than my experience with my family who's in Mexico.
Absolutely.
And so you see very different approaches, and that's why I think later on you say something, but I'll say it up front already, is understanding what type of Mennonite you're talking to matters. But again, you can't know that without conversation.
For sure.
Because you can't necessarily tell that by dress. You can't necessarily tell that by other things. And so the more you know, I think the better. You had a really cool thing in here that you put, the Cultural Iceberg, and I think I've heard of it before. I'd never really seen it. So if you want to talk a little bit about that and the impact that has had.
For sure. So I want to also say, I should have probably done the disclaimer that Albert did right at the beginning. My experience and my understanding of my Mennonite faith and my culture are limited, and I'm one person. So I just would ask you to be curious, remain curious when you're meeting. I hope that this informs you a little bit, but when you're meeting someone that is Low German speaking Mennonite, that you remain curious and you really kind of ask them what their experience was. Where did they come from? Were they born here? Were they born in Mexico? Were they born in Paraguay? Were they born in Bolivia? Where were they born? And how did that inform their current experience? So, I want to talk a little bit about that cultural iceberg. Dimitri, if you want to grab that.
Don't fall off your chair.
I know, I almost fell. I'm going to lean forward a little bit. My short legs can't balance well. So the cultural iceberg. I'm sure you guys have seen this referred to in many different ways. This concept was brought out in 1976. I was born then already.
You're 14 at that point, right? No.
Not quite that
much?
old.
Right.
No, too much. Edward T. Hall suggested that culture was similar to an iceberg. When you first get to know any culture, so I've got friends that are from different cultures. When I'm first introduced to them, I'm probably going to only see 10% of what presents itself. It's usually very easily visible. So the color of your skin, the way you may dress, the things that you may eat, some of your customs, some of your traditions, those are the 10%. And the reason that I actually got really into this was one of my old bosses used to say to me, "You think different." And I was never sure if it was an insult or a compliment. So I was like, I think this actually explains it really well. This cultural iceberg really probably does explain it well, because what's under that first 10% is some of that deeper stuff, the things that inform your culture. So some of the things like your perceptions, your assumptions, your priorities and your core values, the things that you as a people value. And I would say for Low German speaking Mennonites, we value family. We value hard work. We value community and being responsible and caring for our community. These are things that we really deeply value. And what you'll see in the way that our church and our community engages is that we really do deeply care for each other. And one of the things that how we care for each other is very connected to our faith, in that we are expected to be peacemakers, not just peacekeepers, but peacemakers. How can we in the community show our faith? We do that by keeping the peace and finding ways to make peace. So when you are meeting someone, I would just ask you to show cultural humility. So I came across that term a couple of years ago, and I just love it, because I think it captures better than cultural sensitivity. The idea that my culture is different than your culture potentially, but just because it's different doesn't mean it's wrong. So when I'm engaging with my friend from Uganda, for example, I want to be humble in my assumptions that what my experiences aren't better than his experiences, and that he may have something to teach me. He may have something to teach me about family. He may have something to teach me about work. He may have something to teach me about faith and the way that my faith should be shown in the world. And so that's just kind of like a highlight, something to keep in mind, that what you're seeing on the outward may not be, there's so much more to that person that is coming in from the inward out.
Well, and I know we're talking about culture and stuff, but that is a beautiful picture of everything that's wrong with social media. Because all you see is that 10%. And so you see a comment, and because often you don't know these people, you're forced to, with that 10% that you see, make the assumption of the other 90. What's the tone they're using? Why are they saying what they're saying? Because most of us, regardless of where we grew up, obviously your experience of Mennonite was different than mine, but that formed a part of you. But you can't know that unless you know that. And so then when you make a comment about, people in Elmer being a Mennonite wasn't a good thing, I'd go, I thought it was a great thing. I had no idea it wasn't a good thing. But I think that's such a danger when you guys are chiming in online. I find it fascinating. Some of the people, it's become a thing. You just put your comment there, and then people are fighting back and forth. And I'm like, you guys don't even know each other. How are we having this argument, right? And so I think that humility in general, when you're approaching another human being in any conversation, online or in person, I think really matters and changes the dynamics, and it allows dialogue.
Absolutely.
If you remove the humility, you can't have dialogue with anybody, because now all we're trying to do is build up our own pride. I'm smarter than you, so anyways.
Right?
Side note.
I agree.
Social media side note. Okay, let's dive backwards here a little bit. So talk to us a little bit about the history. And so for those of you guys listening, what we're going to try to do is we're going to go a bit from the beginning. We're going to go through some history, and then end off with kind of what types of Mennonites are here, why there's different churches, and we won't go into it too in depth. In a post-COVID world, what would have been really cool is to be able to have people from the different pastors from Elmer, from the different types of churches, come in and just share what their church is like. I think that would have been really neat. But that does not work right now. So why don't you start with give us a bit of a history lesson as to what the Mennonite history is.
Sure. So again, I do these talks and these educational kind of experiences for folks quite a bit. Especially since I've been doing the work at Family and Children's Services. So typically that might take 2 hours. So I'm really kind of like simplifying it. So I get that I'm not going to catch everything in this conversation. So I just really want people to be aware that there's a lot of information you can get into, and I'm just going to kind of give a summary. So earlier I talked about different ways that you could define yourself as a Mennonite, and that was with your history, maybe your last name or your cultural heritage, your experience as a Low German speaking Mennonite, and our cultural experience. And this one would be more related to our faith Anabaptist beliefs. So let's just take a look at our history lesson. So Dimitri, if you want to pull that piece up, awesome. So most Mennonite and Amish groups have common historical roots. We started during the Protestant Reformation in 1525. That's when Martin Luther and Ulrich Zwingli advocated a new Christian order. And this is what I really find cool. This was a movement of urban radicals. Like, these are university students looking at the way things are and how different they should or could be. So what I really found fascinating was we were talking about intellectuals. Really, and I'm certainly not an intellectual. I'm not there. I'm just a social worker.
You have your master's talking to somebody who barely got through grade 12. So.
He's dumbing himself down there. That's not true.
All right, I had a 75%. All right, carry on.
But so, these are urban radicals. These are people who really wanted to shake up that world order. So it started out as a small group of what were called by the community Anabaptists. So that literally just means rebaptizers. So they took a look at what was happening at the time. And at the time, the Catholic Church was the governing body. It was the formal faith of the community or the countries that they were in. And so what this small group did was take a look at the Bible, read it for themselves, and say, I think we might be doing something wrong here. So examining that, they believed that they should be getting baptized as adults after professing a belief in what Jesus had to offer, what Jesus came to do for us. Now,
again, I'm just going to interject here for 1 second. This isn't a conversation about whether or not we agree one way or another. I have friends who are Catholic who I love dearly.
Me too.
This is just the reality of what was happening then. And so just be very clear on that. We're not trying to say...
We're not Catholic bashing.
No.
No, absolutely not. At the time, that's just the reality. The Catholic Church was the government and the faith. So this group really wanted to look at things a little bit differently. They wanted to also make it more accessible to common man, right? At the time, the Roman Catholic Church was they were controlling most of religion, your religious experience. So at the time, the Catholic Church didn't like that very much. And so this small group of Anabaptists started to get persecuted. They got persecuted in their beliefs of being a group of voluntary adults, so voluntarily being baptized upon your profession of faith, and also in their very strongly held beliefs in the separation of church and state. Now, that separation of church and state has followed us over the hundreds of years in terms of our core Mennonite faith beliefs. So that movement, as with the persecution, started to go underground somewhat. And within a few years, there was a Catholic priest who was watching this movement who thought, they're onto something. He had some writings that we started to read, and he became quite well known in our community. And so we got nicknamed after him. His name was Menno Simons. You want to pull up that picture of Menno? Menno is, I think he'd fit into our church now. I actually see my nephew Michael in him. No? Yes? Yep. I see that beard. He would fit in. Could sit in the congregation, right? So that's Menno, and so we got nicknamed after him, Mennonites. Within a couple of years, actually within 100 years, there was a bishop in the Mennonite grouping that felt that the church was becoming a little bit too worldly and a little bit too liberal. So they broke off. He and a few followers broke off, and they became known in what is called the Amish. So when I've worked with the Amish and I've developed relationships with the Amish over the years, we would kind of lovingly refer to ourselves as cousins. Right? That we have the same common roots, but we have some differences in the way that we may practice our Anabaptist beliefs. So with that, 1527, some of our leaders felt that we needed to sit together and come up with a bit of a statement of beliefs. So here's, if you want to bring up that, thank you, slide time confession. That just talks about the beliefs that are specific to the the Mennonite denomination and our faith beliefs. There are some very distinctive beliefs that we have that would be different than, say, the Catholics or some other denominations in the Protestant faith. Baptism is done voluntarily when you profess your faith in Christ. The practice of confrontation, so we discipline our members through confrontation in hopes of reconciliation. You know, at the time in the 1520s, you were brought back in line with the church through torture and jail. And we believed that that probably wasn't the right approach, and that we maybe should use the subtle art of confrontation in order to bring
one
people
more
back.
Sunday morning, I'll tell you.
Right? So at the time, we're talking in the 1500s, folks, communion. We practice the Lord's Supper as a memory of what he has done for us and not as a sacrament. The separation, this is where you may see this is where we differ in terms of our Anabaptist and Mennonite faith, in terms of our grouping within the Mennonite community. Separation, so we are called to be separate from the world. We're separate from the world of sin and violence and evil. And some of our Mennonite families might see that as separation, physical separation, visible separation. So you might see that in the way they dress, in the way they carry themselves, in how they may use or not use technology. I would see that more on, you should be able to see me as different in my behavior, in the way that I carry myself, in the way that I interact with you. You should be able to see that I am a Mennonite by faith, by the way that I love you and care for you and respect you and have conversations with you about what we may agree with or what we may differ on. That's one. And then number 5 is leadership. Our pastors are not priests, are chosen by our local churches, not a hierarchy, not assigned to our community by a governing body.
So if you're wondering anything about our church, you know they chose me. So I feel like that says volumes. Volumes.
It sure does say a lot. So if you want to complain, Joe Wall is our elder in charge. Number 6 is the sword. So we are called to reject all violence, whether for attack, defense, or punishment, and to refuse employment by the state. And so, obviously, I think the first part of that sentence makes most sense for us. And I think all Mennonite groupings would agree with that we are called to be peacemakers. Yeah. Peacekeepers, peacemakers, that we are to seek peace in all of our interactions with the world, with our communities. Those are really, really important pieces. So this is more than just refusing to engage in war and being part of the military. We are called to seek peace, to actively work for peace. And I just want to highlight the work of MCS and MCC in that regard. We have been, both of those organizations have been instrumental in really helping to lead the charge in peacemaking.
Right. Again, and I think the piece about separation from the government, you're dealing with a government that operated and was incredibly different at the time. And so you take that one through very much a local lens where we are privileged to have the type of government we do. Now, not all of us agree with half the stuff our government does, but we have a fairly good government, and a lot of the programs that our government runs are phenomenal. And so, but that might not be the case everywhere where Mennonites are. And so there are some Mennonites who are still very actively practicing because they may live in a place where there is a ton of corruption and they do not want to be employed by that. But I think the peacekeeping piece, and I think some of this, and what I loved going back through this, I know you have one more to go, but one of the things that I love about going through this is I think often us Mennonites have forgotten why we became Mennonites.
Yeah.
And I think part of this is, as you're looking at our community, Mennonites should not be the ones causing the issues. We should be the ones working towards peace. That doesn't mean quietly sitting there doing nothing, but it means actively creating a culture of openness and conversation and compassion. And that's, I think, part of what Mennonites, and as we've gone our colonies and as time goes on, I think you kind of forget what you're about.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm a Mennonite, but that I don't know why. And so I think this is crucial for Mennonites to go back and talk about, as it is for people who aren't Mennonite to understand what we believe.
Absolutely. And I think what I want to say about that as well, just to touch on it, you've tweaked a little memory. To be a pacifist doesn't mean to be passive. We are to be working for peace,
Right.
actively working for peace, seeking reconciliation. And not to stir up. Sometimes we do need to stir things up. But there are ways that we can do that in a peaceful manner. There's absolutely ways that you can be an advocate
Right.
for change without inciting violence, without inciting controversy, and without inciting conflict.
And again,
so those things can happen.
I'll point you guys back to our conversation with Michael
Yes.
Cron last week. We talked about that. We live in a time where our government actually lets us disagree with them. But there are ways of doing it that are appropriate, and then there are ways of doing it that just aren't.
Absolutely. And then the last distinct belief is the oath. We are not to swear oaths of loyalty. So when I go to court and I'm asked to swear that I'm going to tell the truth, I don't put my hand on the Bible and I don't swear, but I would affirm that my yes is a yes and my no is a no, as my parents would say. That we are to be, I think the premise behind that belief is that you are to be such people of character that someone will believe you, believe what you say, because
Right.
your actions are backing up the words that you say.
So just to clarify, you're in court because you work for the agency,
Yeah,
right?
not because I'm in trouble.
Did those
Sorry.
charges get dropped? Sorry.
Yeah, sometimes I have to go to court. So I just want to highlight, based on all of those distinct Anabaptist beliefs, that when you are seeing people in Elgin County, in particular, different churches in Elgin County, those are the things that our Mennonite faith beliefs believe. Regardless of the church that we attend. The Church of God in Elmer, north of town, is not theologically Mennonite. They may have, so if we just bounce back to what I talked about in terms of the three different ways of being a Mennonite, they may have people that attend their church, that are members of their church, that are both historical Mennonite and culturally were raised as Mennonite, but their faith beliefs no longer are in alignment with the Mennonite faith.
Right.
And so they may have some of those pieces to them, but faith-wise, they wouldn't see themselves, they would also probably share this as well, is they are not theologically Mennonite.
Well, and I would say, I'm going to be a little more blunt, when they talk about representing the church, they certainly don't represent us.
No.
And we do not align in any way, shape, or form with that. I am for some of the causes that they're disturbed about, but the way they're going about it and their belief system is something that I am certainly not okay with. And I think I speak for the majority of the churches in Elmer when we say, when they talk about the church, they're not talking about us. And it is a very frustrating thing to navigate. But again, if you have further questions about that, there's a lot of research being done. There's a lot of people diving into that. And so, okay, carry on. Migration. So migration is a big part of who we are. Mm-hmm. We've gone all over the place, and that's part of that colony mindset. We don't like people forcing us to live in ways that and that's playing out now a little bit.
I think so.
As the government is trying to force regulations, there is part of our DNA that says no. And I think that is a part of that struggle and the tension that a lot of Mennonites face in going, do I follow my cultural faith belief or do I follow the government, right? And so it is but it's not just tension for Mennonites. I talk to so many people outside the church who are facing that same tension with a lot of the government stuff, but specifically Mennonites.
So let's take a look at migration. So how did a blonde-haired, blue-eyed little girl get born in Mexico, right? So I didn't know either until I was an adult and really looking into some of our history. So like I said, our movement started in 1525 in Zurich, Switzerland, during the Protestant Reformation, and over the next 150 years, many branches of the Mennonite Church would emerge, including the Old Order Mennonite, Conservative, Ontario Conference, Low German speaking Mennonites, many different types of Mennonites. So the migrations that started in the 1525s were started due to the persecution that they were experiencing from the Catholic Church. But also some of the movements were with just regards to finding areas where they could live out their faith peacefully.
Right.
So With the persecution from the church, many moved into Germany from Switzerland, seeking safer places to express their faith. And then in the 1700s, there was a large group of German Mennonites that were invited to settle in Russia. So Catherine the Great invited a large number of Mennonites to farm land that they didn't want, apparently. So it ended up being about 8,000 Mennonites that moved to Russia in 1700s. This was the largest migration to that point. There were a big group that before that had migrated to the Americas, and that would have been the Swiss Mennonite backing. So there are two kind of big branches of Mennonites, the Swiss Mennonites and the Russian Mennonites. In the 1600s, a bunch of Swiss Mennonites moved to the US. And then in the 1700s, a bunch of the German Mennonites moved to Russia. We stayed in Russia for 100 or so years. And then the Russianization program emerged, and that was regarding the basic thing that they were really trying to do is incorporate all people into Russian culture. And one of the issues that became a problem for our people was the mandatory military service. So our leaders wanted to find other land that we could faithfully stay with our faith, but also be free from military conscription. So in the 1800s, an approximate 18,000 Mennonites left Russia to settle in the States and in Canada. And so our people, my great-great-great-grandparents, moved from Russia to Saskatchewan. We, at that time, and this is actually just going to be a little bit of a sidebar, at that time, our Mennonite groupings took land and occupied land that had been stolen from the First Nations. And so just this little sidebar to recognize that MCC Canada has really led the charge in truth and reconciliation. For our part, the Mennonite Church's part in taking land from First Nations and some of the injustices that First Nations peoples have experienced at our hands and how we've contributed to that. So I want to just really highlight some of the work that MCC Ontario has done in that truth and reconciliation, and really recognize the impact that our people have had on other groups as well. Right. So we stayed in Canada from the 1800s until 1920s, where a group, in the 1920s, a couple of things were happening. World War I was happening. We speak a dialect of...
Apparently not.
Perfect timing.
We don't spoke well,
Perfect timing. We speak a dialect of German. We are pacifist and do not fight in wars. So we had a couple things not going well for us at the time. And so many of our young men were conscripted, but instead of fighting in wars, they were conscientious objectors and required to work in other areas, some labor camps and some other things, in order to not fight in the wars that we were very strongly against. So we migrated. So in the 1920s, those kinds of things were happening. The Education Act was also just came into effect, and a lot of our Mennonite groups or people really felt that we should be educating our children in Low German or High German and in our faith and in our private schools. The Education Act at that time did not allow for that. So our people were being fined huge amounts of money for not complying with that demand. So with all of that, all of those factors kind of taking into account, they were looking for places that would offer them freedom to practice the way that they felt that they needed to practice. And so some of our leaders found some land in Mexico and Paraguay, Bolivia, and Belize, and mass migration again at that time. That was my grandparents and my great-grandparents. A little funny story. I didn't know any of this. So when we would go and visit our grandparents in Mexico, one of our traditions, one of the Mennonite people traditions and Low German speaking Mennonite traditions is that in order to get your gift at Christmas time, your little basket of goodies, you would have to recite a poem.
Yeah, we call it a vench.
A vench. And we weren't taught that because we had been raised here, so I was never taught how to do that. So what we would do is sing for my grandparents, or it was our great-grandparents at the time. So my brothers and I have 5 brothers, I probably should have said that at the beginning. My brothers and I would just sing them usually a Christmas carol. And at one point, we thought we would be funny, and we would just, they don't know anyway, they just speak Low German. We just sang them O Canada. We thought we were hilarious. And my grandparents, or my great-grandparents, they just smiled and nodded, you know. I found out later they were fully fluent in English. I had no idea. They could read, write, speak English. They never let on. Not one time did I know they could speak a lick of English. And so we were singing this song that we didn't think that they would even know, and they knew, but they didn't let on. Again, they maintained the facade. So that's how we came to be in Mexico. How did we come back here? So Mexico is a really harsh, rough place to raise families and to have the ability to feed your families. And so my parents made a very conscious decision. It was a hard decision because you're leaving everything you know, right. And decided to migrate here in the 1970s. And I think that's what's prompting a lot of people to come back, to migrate back to Canada, is because there are better opportunities often for families. And I think that's the difference between these migrations are they're no longer mass migrations, they're one family at a time right. migrations. But we tend to migrate to areas where there are other Low German speaking families.
Well, and I think a bit of a side note here, but some of the issues that the people in our region have had with Mennonites is the fact that we did this back and forth thing.
Yeah.
And so we'd come up here and work for a couple months and then go to Mexico and then I come up here. And so what ends up happening is you don't feel like this is your home. And so you don't care for it the way you would care for somebody else's home, right? And so I think that's been part of it, but you're seeing less and less of that. I know my parents thought we would have a better future up here. Mm-hmm. And so my parents owned farmland in Mexico and they sold it all, moved up here, and my dad worked his tail off to provide us as kids an opportunity. And I think that's also... all that to say, it's very easy to bash Canada when you live here, but it is a great place to live.
Absolutely.
It is a great place to raise families. This part of the world, I mean, we're always about making it better, but we're lucky. Mm-hmm. I mean, we live in a very good part of the world, and very, very thankful for that. So let's sum it up here a little bit. So migration, we end up here. Your last slide here. What does it mean to be Mennonite? I think we've answered a lot of it, the different layers of it. But then even then within that, in our region here, there's a ton of different churches that go by the name Mennonites. What does that look like? What does it mean? Kind of wrap it up here.
So Mennonite, it's simply a label. It's one easy way to identify your faith belief. So it's just connected to our Protestant leader, Menno Simons. I think I've talked about our unique or distinct faith beliefs that are maybe different than other Christian denominations. But it is just simply a denomination in the Christian faith. Within the Mennonite faith, there's many groupings, from conservative to liberal, and I think you could probably say that of any faith group.
100%.
There probably is conservative to liberal in any faith group or any culture. I think we tend to, in our church here, in our community, tend to be a little bit more on the liberal side than the ultra-conservative side. Obviously, I don't wear a head covering, and nor am I wearing a dress today, right? So, although, we could put the mask on and use that as a diuk instead. No. But there are very many different Mennonite groupings. So in Elgin County, we have the Old Colony Mennonite Church. We have the Zummefeld Church. We have a Kleine Gemeinde Church. The EMC, which is us. The EMMC. We have quite a few different Mennonite churches. We have people from our cultural upbringing who have attended other churches. I have, one of my brothers was baptized into a Baptist church. So I know English.
A baptized church?
Baptized. We're not going to bring up any of those references today. So there are very many groupings here in our community.
Right.
What I, again, would want you just to be aware of, it's really important to know which group you're talking about. And in order to know which group you're talking about, really just use that cultural humility. Come from a place of humility where you're seeking to know and understand someone better. And I would do the same from someone who is not in my group, right, who wasn't raised Mennonite. And actually, I need to do that even within my own cultural group. I had this experience over Christmas where I was meeting a Low German speaking family for the first time. I made assumptions based on the way they were dressing. You know, their mom had a head covering on, very conservative dress. I made assumptions based on the way that they presented themselves to me. And by the end of my meeting with them, I was blown away with how wrong my assumptions were. So remain curious. Ask questions. And when you come from a place of humility to ask those questions, most people from in our community are very happy to answer questions about what we believe and how we want to practice our faith beliefs.
Right. So I think one of the things that when you're looking at that and you go, why are there so many different churches? Why do they break off so often? And this is a question people in general, when you think about the church, they ask the question, why are there so many different churches? I say, because we are all created so differently and uniquely, and I think it's part of what makes it beautiful. Like, I think a lot of people view it as a negative, and I just see it over and over again. The longer I live, like the beauty of how different people are and how their expression of worship is different. But if you go outside the church, I have a lot of friends who are outside the church. They wouldn't all fit in this church. The difference between often, churched and un is that we're categorized. Mm-hmm. We have a category that you fit in. Oh, you're Old Colony. Well, I have friends who would probably fit better in Old Colony than they would here, because everybody has a belief system of some sorts. It's just within the faith, and we want to articulate which one is that, right? And so I think it's beautiful. I think the Mennonites in our region, and we really tried to highlight that in our promo video for this, was there are a lot of Mennonites who have contributed significantly. And are definitely a part of making this community good. The numbers, I didn't pull up the slide of the numbers you had, but I think the data you gave was there's about 10,000 Mennonites that live in Elgin. Yep. And of those, are there troublemakers? Yes. Some of them are my children. Just kidding. Sorry, my kids are awesome. I love you. I know you're watching. But so many have made incredible advancements in different fields, whether that's medicine or agriculture, and they're definitely a huge asset to this community. So with that, I want to wrap this up a little bit, and we're going to kind of broaden this again. Having grown up as somebody who, it wasn't a visible minority necessarily, but you grew up as part of a minority and a judged minority. And now having the ability to have hindsight and seeing the problems around us, what's some advice you would give to people in our local region about how to love people who are different than you? How do you, and I know the cultural humility is I mean, it's such a beautiful aspect. So is there anything beyond that you're thinking of? Because I think that's such a key part.
I think one of the lessons I'm learning and continue to learn is listening for the purposes of understanding, rather than the purposes of changing their mind, right? So, again, I said this earlier, but just because it's different doesn't make it wrong. Right. When you're talking about culture in specifics. But listening for the purposes of understanding, really trying to get to what is motivating this person? How can I better understand them in order to better serve them? Right? Because we've been called as a church. So you've referred to this, like we've got so many faces of Mennonites, so many different groupings of Mennonites, but we are all one global church. Whether you're Mennonite or Baptist or Pentecostal or Lutheran, we are one global church, and we all have a role to play. We all have a way that we can change our small part of the world. How can you be Jesus to the people in your community? And when I'm thinking about Jesus, I imagine that he did a lot of listening. Right? When you look through the Bible and you see how many words of Jesus there isn't that much.
Well, and he also asked a lot of questions.
Right? So, being a listener, listening for the purposes of understanding so that you can better understand where their perspective is coming from and why they believe what they believe. And then how can we as Christians reach out to our community and actively peacemake? So how can we be part of the solution? I know I would say 99% of the families I'm working with and I see are wearing a mask, whether they want to or not, whether they agree it's helpful or not. They're wearing a mask as a way to show that they love Jesus and they love you, right? As a community. We love our community, and this is the way that we're going to do, this is the way that we serve you. Right? And so how can we as a community look at, how can I love you better? How can I serve you better? Is really what the challenge would be, whether you're Mennonite or not.
Well, and I think that's been one of the issues with the response is it actually does no benefit to just say Mennonites are the problem.
Yeah.
I'm all for if the government makes a rule and they want me to wear a mask, I'll wear a mask. And if there's some Mennonites who aren't wearing masks, converse with them. But make no mistake, this isn't a Mennonite thing.
No.
I mean, there are a lot of people who are not Mennonites who are not wearing masks in Elmer. And I think that's where, instead of categorizing people, look, people, we need to wear masks. And let's have that. Instead of saying, well, it's the Mennonites, it's the this, it's that. And I think that always does more harm and adds another layer of pain that is completely unnecessary.
For sure.
So with that, I think we are going to wrap up. I know there have been a few questions about the difference in the Kitchener and here. I will say one quick thing about that. They've had some answers in there. One thing that I know about Kitchener is that MCC was very heavily invested in that community. And I think anytime we as a church invest in our community, their perception changes. And I'm convinced there's a lot of great churches who are investing deeply in our community right now, and I think that perception of Mennonite has also changed. I know there's people who are blaming the Mennonites, but there are also a lot of people in Elmer who love us as Mennonites, and we love them back, and we were a part of that community.
For sure.
Well, one of the things I would just say to everyone is, if we're going to move ahead as a community, we have to find a way to lead with love. We all have biases. You guys had biases coming in towards me. You have biases towards Anne. When I told you had 6 kids, you had some biases. Just admit it. Own it, right? Some of you were jealous. Some of you guys are like, you're part of the problem. Why do you have so many, right?
Yeah.
But we all have biases, and I think that's a reality. But we lead with love. And so, yes, I have a bias, that a certain assumption may be going into something. But instead of acting on that bias, I'm going to allow my humility to say, hey, I'm making some assumptions, but I don't want to live on assumptions. Hey, tell me more about your culture. Tell me more about why you're doing what you're doing. And I think that can go such a long way.
For sure.
A simple question, hey, why aren't you wearing a mask? Maybe that is the person that actually has a medical exemption. Maybe it's not, but lead with that. When you're dealing with people of different cultures, and I would say specifically to us as Mennonites, because we have typically tried to avoid other cultures, lead with love. Jesus had a way of dealing with people who are so different than him, didn't have the same faith system, and he still led with love. And I think that's such a crucial part, that when people interact with us, they can say, I may disagree with you, but I definitely felt loved in that conversation. And that's I think, the effect of Jesus on our lives.
Absolutely.
And so with that, Anne, would you do us the honor of closing in prayer, and then we will wrap it up.
Sure. Heavenly Father, we just come before you with humility, remembering all of the things that you have done for us and that how deeply you love us. And I'm sure that it just hurts your heart to see that the way our community is divided, and how this was not your vision of the church. Lord, I just pray that each of the churches in our area would remember that, remember our calling to love each other and to serve you. I just pray that as those that may be hearing this message in the first time, this has just left them with a little bit of a tiny bit of a better understanding of what being a Mennonite is, and how we as a Mennonite people are trying to love and serve you. I just pray that this will open up doors, that people will have conversations, that they will be able to hear what you would have them to know about us, and what you would have them to know about you, and what this says about your nature. Lord, I just pray that you will put an end to COVID. I just believe that there will be an end. You have to believe that there will be an end, Lord. And I pray that you will give us love for each other and patience with each other while we're finishing what looks like the end of this very long road. I just ask these things in your name. Amen.
Amen. Thanks for watching. Next week, we are going to be going into part 3, and we're going to talk about grief and loss, which has been something that's been very difficult for a lot of people during COVID who lost loved ones. And so I got a friend, Jason Dykstra, who's coming down and going to talk about the loss of a child and his journey through grief. And so really hoping you can join us then. Thanks again. Have a great week.